Hey everybody, Dylan here. Welcome back to my channel where I talk about all things video production, video editing, and color grading and color correction. This is a place where I like to share my videos, the videos that I make with you, give you a little insight into my process behind the scenes. So hopefully you can learn something from them, improve your own videos and your own craft. Today, we're doing just that. I'm gonna show you one of my recent videos, and then afterward, I'll go into how I color grade some of my favorite shots from that video. One, really. I think we'll have time for one shot. Recently, my wife and I took a trip to England to visit her family, my extended family out there. It was a great trip. We hadn't been out there for over 2 years, so it was great to see everybody again. Of course, I brought my camera. I didn't intend to shoot that much because I was more focused on reuniting with all the family members we hadn't seen in a long time, but I did bring my camera and I did take it out and shoot on a few occasions. So I threw that all together into a nice little B-roll montage with some music and threw a nice grade on there. And that's what I'm gonna show you right now. Stick around afterwards because I'm gonna go a little bit into the post-production process for it, specifically the color grading for one of my favorite shots. So stick around for that afterwards. Hopefully you'll learn something, but for now, enjoy the video.
Well, what we're going to do, we're going to scald it first. Do you know what that means? That means we're going to put some hot water in, just to rinse it out, because it might not have been used for a little while, this. Wrong. To just help clean it. Okay. So I'm going to just only half fill that. And you're going to take the milk in. Okay, right. What? They're going to come back tomorrow and say, can we have a crumpet? Can you say that? That's a mallard as well. This is a mallard.
Thanks for watching my video. I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks for watching it all the way to the end and staying to this portion afterward. I think you're gonna really appreciate it. A little bit about the video production before we get into the color grading. I shot this entire video on my Blackmagic Pocket Cinema Camera 4K using the Sigma Art 18 to 35mm f1.8 lens. I shot this entire video handheld, again, trying to conserve space. I didn't bring a gimbal or a tripod or anything like that. But without further ado, I'd like to take you into my color grading process. So let's hop over into DaVinci Resolve and I'll show you a little behind the scenes on one of my favorite shots. All right, so here we are on the color page of DaVinci Resolve, and this is the shot, my favorite shot from the piece. Naturally, it's of my wife, and she's looking beautiful as always. The reason why I love this shot is one, the composition. You know, having her on the left side of the frame there with a little lead in front of her. Also the color contrast. I mean, we got, you know, a rich green lawn here, blue sky, some orange in her hood, the blue over her eyes. All those colors work really well together. And there's some really soft, natural lighting going across her face there. So there's a lot to work with. We're gonna color grade this thing. As you can see here, this is my final grade for this shot, all the nodes that I used, but we're gonna rebuild this from scratch so I can show you my thought process behind each of these and how I got from beginning to end. So the first thing I do is actually set the last node. The last node is always gonna be my color space transform, or CST, as I label it. And what that's gonna do is do a lot of the heavy lifting in the first part of the grade for us. So, you know, we're all used to seeing a certain color space, whether you know it or not. From watching broadcast TV, we're used to seeing what's called the Rec 709 color space. So that's the first thing I'm gonna do, is transform the color space that we're working in, which is Blackmagic, to Rec 709. And you use the color space transform effect. The only thing I need to do here is set the input color space. Since the default color space for our timeline is Rec 709, I just need to tell it what's going into this color space transform effect for it to spit out the Rec 709. So I'm gonna set this as Blackmagic Design Pocket 4K Film, Gen 4. Same thing for the gamma. And already you see, if I turn the node off, Option D I'm using here, that turns all nodes off. On, that's doing a lot of work already without even doing much, just with that color space transform node. So what we're gonna do next is work backwards from this node. So this is the last thing I want to take place, and I want all my changes to be upstream or before this color space transformation. So I'm gonna press Shift S to create a new node, and that's gonna be actually my base color correction node. So I'm gonna label that as base. I'm gonna use my primary wheels, this button over here in this section of the color page, to adjust shadow, highlights, and midtones. So right now, if I look at the waveform, we're a little low. I mean, this is, you know, there aren't a lot of highlights in the shot, but I am gonna bring up the exposure just a little bit so we have some more room to play with. So that seems about right. And when I'm doing all of these adjustments, I'm always using first my eyes. I'm looking at the monitor, seeing what looks good. And then I'm also using, you know, a combination of what I see with the tools I have available to me. So in this case, I'm using my eyes and the waveform to judge whether the exposure is proper. So I've raised it up a little bit there by using this offset control. Now I'm going to use the rest of the primary wheels, the lift, gamma, and gain wheels here corresponding to shadow, midtones, and highlights. First, I'm gonna take the shadows or the lift, I'm gonna bring it down, watching my waveform to make sure I'm not crushing anything, and give it a little bit more contrast. You know, the primary wheels are very powerful at this stage of the grade. They can, again, add a lot of life and character to the image without doing much. And then I'm gonna raise the highlights next, spreading out this waveform in the image that you see here. So we have a lot of range. I can quickly turn that off and on. So that's with the color space transform and nothing else. And that's with our base correction. Great, now looking a little brighter. And then, you know, if we turn off both, this is where we started and this is where we are now. Already a lot has been done with just 2 nodes, which is pretty cool. All right, so the next node I'm gonna do, I'm gonna press Option S to create a new node ahead of my base node, and I'm gonna call that NR for noise reduction. I always like to, since I just raised the exposure of this image, that naturally introduces noise into the image. So I'm gonna add some noise reduction to compensate for that. I'm going to put my motion estimation type on better. And I'm just gonna do about a value of 6 here. I shot this at ISO 400, which is one of the dual native ISOs on the Blackmagic camera when shooting in Blackmagic RAW. So we're gonna get a great quality image because we shot at that ISO. So there's not gonna be much noise naturally, but like I said, since I did increase the exposure, I'm gonna wanna put a little bit of noise reduction in there to compensate. Next node is gonna be for white balance. I'm gonna type WB there. I'm gonna use the HDR wheel controls over here in the HDR section because I like that the way, I mean, sometimes I'll use offset in the regular log or primary wheels. But in HDR, it's a little more, it has a better shift when you're manipulating warmth and temperature and tint in this panel. So I like the way that it reacts, especially for small adjustments. This shot looks pretty good already. But what I am gonna do is I notice it's a little green. So I'm first gonna cool it off by pulling it down here. And you see, like, you know, you move a lot, but not a lot is going on, which is good. You know, subtle is always your friend. To compensate for that green, which I still believe is in there, I'm just gonna pull this a little bit, the tint towards purple. I'm kind of liking where that's, and this is something, you know, that you get an eye for after you do it a lot. You know, it's easier said than done, but the more you grade, the more you practice these things, the better your eye will get at judging exposure, white balance, and things of that nature. You see a little shift in color there, on, off, on. Yeah, and then I'm just gonna dial back on this tint just a little bit, because it's seeing a little purple. Yeah, and I'm happy with that. I'm gonna increase, bring in some saturation to the image here. I'm gonna use my RGB mixer to do that. It's a great way to introduce saturation into the image. I'm gonna drag up all of the red, green, and blue output things. And right away, you know, obviously, you're probably asking yourself, well, wow, that looks terrible. You know, you said it was a great way to introduce saturation to an image, but that does not look good at all. The great thing about Resolve is that you can, for each of these nodes, you can control, you know, the mix of them, how much of their properties are being applied to the image, node by node. And to do that, I'm gonna use the node key. So I'm gonna go right down to the gain under key output here, and I'm gonna bring this right down to 0.5. That's a good place I always like to start to see, and then you can drag this up till it gets to the saturation point that you feel is appropriate. Now, again, using a combination of my eyes looking at the image and then looking at the vector scope, you can see here as I increase saturation that the values on the vector scope are spreading out, you know, closer and closer to the edge. Now, you know, once you get past a certain point, you're reaching overexposure. So that's what you're gonna wanna watch out for. But primarily, I'm using my eye to judge where it looks good. All right, perfect. So I think that's about right around 0.6 there. Good. And then moving on from saturation, we're moving on to really trying to make this image pop and give it some character. All right, so the first part of that is what is called luminance grade. I'm just gonna label that Lum grade. And we do that in our curves, our custom curves. And I'm just controlling the luminance here, so I just wanna make sure this Y value is checked and nothing else, no RGB. To make sure that I'm focusing on the luminance of this image and not any other characteristic, I'm gonna bring the saturation of it all the way down. And I do that by adjusting the saturation value here over in the primary wheels. So our image has gone black and white, and if we come over to custom curves, we can start to bring in some contrast by doing a simple S curve. Again, looking at the image. The most important thing is watching what you're doing when you're doing it. And this is more of this is a matter of personal taste. I want the shadows to be deep, but I do not want to lose detail. I'm going to switch back over to my waveform here so they can see where my values are hitting in terms of shadows and highlights. So, you know, I've brought just that small adjustment, and I'll show you again, bringing that down has brought, you know, those shadow values, those values at the bottom of the waveform closer to 0, but not quite at 0. And they look, you know, it looks nice bringing these shadows around in her hood down so that her face is highlighted a little bit more. And I'm gonna now adjust the midtones and highlights. Once I'm happy with the luminance values, I'm gonna bring the saturation back up. This is looking pretty good, around 42 here. So after luminance, we're getting closer to the end of this process here. I wanna add some saturation contrast. So I'm gonna label that SatCon. And what I'm gonna use here is the Sat versus Sat curve. That's this little icon with the 2 drops. And what I'm doing here is boosting saturation in the lower saturated areas, and then reducing saturation in the higher saturation areas. So I'm evening out our saturation contrast, and by raising this lower end and then lowering this far end. And just to show you what I'm doing there, it's again a subtle change, but you see the saturation in her skin is popping a little bit more. saturation in her hood is really starting to come out. Now I want to add something that you know, is a relatively new effect. I think it was new in one of the most recent versions, which is glow. It's a glow effect that really does a great job in adding a unique type of contrast into your image. I'm going to manipulate the areas in which it glows and then mix it with the original image so that we get a nice bloom beyond what the 1/8 Black Pro Mist filter was giving us in the highlights in certain areas of the image. I'm going to change the composite type to soft light. It's a much more pleasing glow across the image. And then I'm gonna look at the shiny regions to show us what regions of the image that the glow is being applied to. And then I can manipulate that by dragging this slider here. So, you know, we're getting the sky, we're getting the edges of her hood, and then we start to include some of the highlights in her skin. That's what I do want to include. I want to include some of those, not a lot of it, because we don't overpower the image with this glow, but sliding down the shine threshold there so that we include a little bit more than the sky is good. I think I'm happy with that. All right, so we're gonna change this back to glowing image. And then, you know, I don't really mess with any of this stuff over here. I go right down to gain to see how much glow I want, knowing that I'm gonna reduce it in the global blend characteristic down here. So I'll bring the game up just a little above default, and then I'll start to blend with the original image. Just so that it's not too dark, but we have some additional contrast in here. Okay, you know, I like the exposure of the image at that blend level. I'm gonna bring it a little bit lower actually, just so we're not losing too much. And you see our waveform here. I'm still keeping an eye on what's being crushed. We're not crushed yet on some of these lower values, but they're getting nice and close to the bottom, and our highlights are way up here. So we got a nice spread of contrast. Before and after, before and after. Now what I like to do is really start to do some stylistic additions, you know, first of which being a vignette. And so I'll use a mask here, a power window rather, a circular one, and put it over our subject's face. And I'll do that. And then feather it out so I can see where the area that it's affecting quickly by pressing Shift H, and that'll show me the area the mask is affecting. I do want to spread it out so we're not cutting off any of the areas of the face. And I've tilted it, you know, rotated it so that it covers her face. Then I'm going to create what's called an outside node. Using the power window that I've just put in that vignette node, I'm going to press Option O, and that is going to reverse the area of focus of that vignette. You see here that it's the opposite of the previous. So that's what an outside node does. It kind of reverses, you know, if you have a mask on there or a power window, it'll reverse that or invert it. And I'm going to call this node focus. This is where I start to force focus to the important parts of the image, in this case, Stephanie's face. And I do that by bringing contrast down, and you see that right away the outside parts of the image are getting a little bit more washed out. And bring it down to about here. And then I'm going to adjust the exposure, creating what's more typically, you know, more of a typical vignette. But at the same time, you know, we're not only reducing exposure, but we're reducing contrast. So the most contrasty part of the image is now going to be Steph's face. And that's, you know, almost, you know, going to draw your eye to that area. So here's the vignette. And here's what we did with that focus. We darkened the edges around Steph's face. And just to make sure that as this image moves, that we're not, you know, that darkness is not bleeding onto the subject's face or getting into areas that we don't want, I'm going to track it back and forth using this nifty track it back and forth tool here. Okay, so that's looking pretty good. Our window is nice and tracked. And in addition to darkening the outsides, I'm going to come back to this vignette and I'm going to add, I'm going to boost the midtones on Steph's face just slightly so that we have a little bit, you know, more emphasis on that area. Just 6 or 7 points in the log wheels. I'm moving away from my primary color wheels here because those are more powerful, you know, more useful for our base corrections. Going over to the log wheels and just boosting it slightly. Now to see, you know, what I've done there, just to show you quickly, before, after, after. Very slight. Cool. All right, so after focus, we have our final steps. So we're almost done with the image here. We just want to clean it and desaturate it. What I like to do next is to clean the darkest part of the images, the shadows. So what I'll do here is come over to our luminance versus saturation and just kind of drop off the lowest, the darkest parts of the image in terms of their saturation, clean those blacks, clean those shadows. This is something you often really can't see, but you look at the values here on the curve and know you're cutting out something. So I like to cut off, just the bottom end of those, and I'll flip it on and off just to make sure I'm not destroying anything. And then second to last, I will do general sharpening. And we'll come over to the blur and sharpen area here. Make sure we're on sharpening. Drag this radius down, only a couple points. You really don't need anything more. Now that we've sharpened, the very last thing we're gonna do is slightly desaturate the entire image one more time, just to give it a more natural look, because when you're looking, well, at least the style that I like is a very natural looking image, not too doctored, not too overly contrasty or saturated. I like something to look like it does, or better than real life, but like it could be real life. So I'll do a final node here before our color space transform and just bring the saturation down a little bit, just a few points to give us our final image here. So this is our final image. It's looking really good. This is where we started and this is where we ended up, right? So looking pretty darn good. That's it. That's how I color grade my videos. Hopefully I didn't get too in the weeds there for you. Hopefully you were able to digest some of that information, and I hope that you'll be able to take some of it and apply it to your own work in future videos. If you like what you saw, please be sure to hit that like button. It really helps out my channel a lot. If you really liked what you saw and you want to see more videos like this, please consider subscribing. I'll be putting out more videos like this on video editing, video production, color grading, and color correction. And definitely hit that bell, turn on all notifications so you'll stay up to date with what I got coming out next. Thanks for watching this all the way through. I hope you enjoyed it. And as always, keep creating, keep editing, and I'll see you in the next one.